Australia's home to a number of critters that qualify among the most dangerous in the world. Most would presume that the top of the list would be the fierce man-eating great white shark. But those much maligned creatures only kill on average just one human a year. There are others that deserve to be more feared within those coastal waters, such as the stinging stonefish, which, according to Brian Fry, a venom researcher at the University of Queensland, produces such mind-blowing agony that the body goes into shock and the person dies. Things don't get much safer once you reach the shore, as Australia is home to the world's most venomous snake, toxic funnel web spiders, as well as their famous estuary crocodiles. Yet ask an Australian as to what the most dangerous animal on the continent is, and you might hear rumors of the fierce grey menace. A creature so dangerous and destructive to the locals' way of life that they will go out of their way to hunt down the babies of the beast. The Australian Broadcasting Corporation reported that in the 1880s, this creature represented the greatest threat to Australia's political and economic future. In response, the government began a campaign utilizing world-famous actresses in order to bring in the world's foremost scientific minds, offering a $10 million prize for anyone that could come up with a solution so that the people of Australia could once again live in peace. When all that failed, they resorted to unleashing biological warfare. What is this ultra-violent beast? Well, you can see it in the shadowy depths of most of the world's forests. A creature cloaked in fur that camouflages it to the point that you can't see it silently stalking you. Its eyes, gleaming orbs of an otherworldly luminescence, seem to pierce through the very fabric of reality, holding secrets untold. Razor-sharp talons, unseen but imagined, creating an illusion of impending doom. It's a creature known to have an insatiable hunger, a hunger that transcends mere mortal comprehension. From the descriptions provided by Australians, one might expect a grotesque monster to emerge. Yet the ominous figure that I'm describing is merely a soft, small, and quite fluffy bunny rabbit. You're listening to Empires, Anarchy, and Other Notable Moments, a podcast designed for deep dives that assist in the teaching of history. This series is about Australia's attempts to outsmart the wild. Episode number 1, Kill the Rabbit. I hope I didn't frighten you too much, but I needed to warn you in the same way that the enchanter Tim attempted to alert King Arthur in Monty Python's Search for the Holy Grail. His warning, of course, goes unheeded as he proclaimed, "Follow only if ye be men of valor, for the entrance to this cave is guarded by a creature so foul, so cruel, that no man yet has fought with it and lived. Bones of full 50 men lie strewn about its lair, so brave knights, if you do doubt your courage or your strength, come no further, for death awaits you all with nasty, big, pointy teeth." John Cleese and his comedic crew took the idea from a relief carved within the ancient walls of Paris's Notre Dame Cathedral, which showed a fully armed knight fleeing in terror from a rabbit. But they could have easily taken inspiration for the scene from their nation's former colonial holding of Australia. The colonization of Australia by the British Empire officially began in January of 1788. 18 years earlier, British captain James Cook sailed along the eastern coast of the continent and claimed the land for England. It represented an accidental discovery, as Cook's mission was to study the planetary transit of Venus. For the imperialist Brits, Australia represented a blank canvas, something to be shaped however they wished. Although Cook described the land as empty, he was well aware of the indigenous population, having himself shot an Aboriginal during his initial visit. From the outset, the locals had made it clear that the outsiders were not welcome, but their spears were no match for the guns of the late 18th century. This didn't mean that Cook entirely dismissed the locals, noting in his personal journal that, in reality, they are far happier than we Europeans, being wholly unacquainted not only with the conveniences so much sought after in Europe, they live in a tranquility which is not disturbed by the inequality of condition. They have a good air to breathe and live in a temperate climate. Australia was no exception to the rule that violence always followed in the wake of the British Empire. Professor John Maynard is an Australian historian of Indigenous descent. He notes that any Aboriginal understanding recognizes that following Cook's planting of a British flag down upon the soil of Possession Island, that cataclysmic consequences were unleashed upon the entire Aboriginal population of the continent. Following Cook claiming the continent for the British Crown, and in the wake of the British First Fleet arrival in 1788, Aboriginal society would totter on near complete annihilation. That wasn't their initial intention, as England just wanted to use the continent as a place to store its excess rubbish, specifically its unwanted prisoners. Incredibly, government-run police forces are a relatively new concept. The first organized police force in England were the Bow Street Runners in 1749. Historic UK reveals that before the introduction of the Bow Street Runners and anything of the like, policing took the form of privately paid individuals used to maintain law and order without a formal system connected to the state. This resulted in unofficial policemen who were known as thief-takers, who would capture criminals for money and negotiate deals in order to return stolen goods whilst claiming rewards. People who partook in this activity, such as a figure called Charles Hutchin and his accomplice Jonathan Wild, were voluntarily policing the streets of London for big profits, when in fact these men and others like them were often behind much of the crime in the area. The informal volunteer-based system was not working. The lack of policing resulted in absurdly high crime rates throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. The vast majority of crimes committed were petty theft and robbery, crimes that tend to spike during periods of widespread poverty, as people are forced into stealing in order to survive. The expansion of informal organizations policing their communities quickly resulted in the limited numbers of prisons becoming overrun. That led to the British government recommissioning old warships to utilize as new centers of incarceration. With so many behind bars for small crimes, and the fact that the average age of the criminals was just 21, England began to realize that it had a looming problem. The prison ships were initially set up as a temporary measure, as England had traditionally shipped its criminals to the United States. But the outbreak of the Revolutionary War put a halt to that practice, and the ships were instead moored offshore. The BBC refers to them as floating hells. Novelist Charles Dickens referred to them in his classic work, Great Expectations, as a wicked Noah's Ark. These makeshift prisons were initially run by private contractors. The BBC writes that the inmates reacted with horror to their new confinement. On their first coming on board, the universal depression of spirits was astonishing. Within months, sickness ripped through the Justia, the first private floating prison. Of 632 men incarcerated on that hulk between August 1776 and March 26, 1778, 167 died, more than 1 in 4. Their bodies were buried in unmarked graves on shore, unless collected by relatives or illicitly passed to anatomists for dissection. Parliament soon heard testimony from philanthropist John Howard that many prisoners had no shirts, shoes, or socks. They either had no bedding or shared a blanket, and they slept on wooden boards, with the healthy lying close to the sick prisoners. One convict even told him that he was ready to sink into the earth. Their food amounted to moldy biscuits and water filtered from the river. Another visitor to the floating prisons claimed that if I were to attempt a full description of the miseries endured in these ships, he wrote, I could fill a volume. The deplorable conditions failed to deter the crime spree. Although you might find that illogical, California's failed 3 strikes you're out law provides powerful modern-day empirical evidence that harsh punishments absolutely fail to deter small criminal acts. Although the British government entertained the possibility of implementing the death penalty, they decided that shipping their petty criminals on a one-way trip halfway around the world to Australia was a kinder alternative. The first 11 ships filled to the brim with criminals set sail in May of 1787. After first visiting the site where James Cook had landed, they settled upon Sydney Harbour for the location of Australia's first penal colony. Most of the 700 prisoners that disembarked had been sentenced for 7 years, but a few carried a life sentence for their crimes. To be clear, the men's sentenced were not placed within a traditional prison in Australia. Instead, the island itself was to be the prison. Arthur Phillip served as the first governor of New South Wales, as well as the chief warden of the penal colony. Upon disembarking, the prisoners were immediately put to work creating their own houses and farms. Males outnumbered female prisoners by a 6-to-1 margin, and it was hoped that allowing the men the chance to own their own land in order to have the chance to produce things of economic value would keep them from acting on their prior criminal impulses. The logic behind such thoughts remain embedded within the Swedish criminal justice system, as a number of their modern facilities are deemed as open prisons, allowing the convicts to exit the facility in order to continue working their jobs. Remarkably, all of the evidence points out that this rehabilitative focus on incarceration works far better than the American punitive model. The lack of walls didn't mean that the British convicts were on easy street. In fact, the first prisoners weren't on a street at all, as they were assigned to work gangs in order to build the first roads. Flogging was a common punishment for misbehavior or non-compliance, but those individuals that exhibited good behavior were able to live a relatively normal life within the penal colony. The variety of criminals helped the experiment succeed, as Professors Deborah Oxley and Amish Maxwell Stewart revealed when they wrote that convicts arrived in the colonies having experienced a multiplicity of trades consistent with the diversity of labor markets in the United Kingdom. Between them, they had been employed at thousands of different jobs. Several predominated: laborers, and farm servants, plowmen, grooms, shoemakers, tailors, butchers, cooks, and housemaids, to name a few. There were eventually over 1,000 shepherds, immediately useful to a sheep run. Upon the successful completion of their sentence, the ex-cons were entitled to expand their land holdings, which furthered the colonization of Australia. Presumed to have been rehabilitated, these men and women soon brought a taste of home to this virgin land. Samuel Terry, a former inmate, achieved the title of Australia's richest man ever by running a legitimate business importing foreign goods and selling them through his pubs. At his death, he was worth 3.39% of the colony's GDP, holding wealth whose equivalent today would be in excess of $24 billion. There were two main concerns for the European migrants who decided to remain in Australia, the first of which was a lack of women. Oxley and Maxwell Stewart eloquently note that colonial Australia's white population smelt largely of testosterone. Prudent Victorian England feared that the lack of available women would result in ex-cons participating in homosexual acts, or perhaps even turn to acts of bestiality. Governor Phillips even wrote to his benefactors in London that the lusts of the men were so urgent as to require the prostitution of the most abandoned women to contain them. Soon, large numbers of convicted female prostitutes were being shipped off to serve their sentences in the land down under. Having completed their sentences, many of these women proceeded to establish legitimate brothels throughout the land. Historian Raylene Francis explains the significance, noting that Deborah Oxley makes another important point in identifying prostitution as a structural part of the capitalist patriarchy which characterized colonizing society. Working class women's role in this society was primarily to reproduce the working class, future, past, and present. An intricate part of this role was the provision of sexual services to men through marriage, force, or payment. Sex was commercialized and turned into a commodity. The convict era was thus crucial in setting the pattern for the history of prostitution in Australia. It saw the establishment of the sex industry as an important part of the life experience and work options of women within colonizing society. It was also during this period that the extent of prostitution came to be used as a gauge of the worth of colonial women and of the success of colonial society more generally. Prostitution assumed a rhetorical and symbolic significance quite apart from its importance as an avenue for women's economic survival. The second challenge facing the colonists were the Aboriginals, who had land claims that went back at least 40,000 years. The British ignored all legitimate local claims to the land, determining that the Aboriginal peoples, or First Nations people as they prefer to be referred to, were wasting the economic value of the land and therefore had somehow forfeited their rights to it. Freed convicts began to import and herd sheep in 1797, bringing in the Merino breed, a Spanish variety that was well suited to the Australian environment. By the late 1800s, wool had become Australia's chief export. The nation remains the world's largest exporter of sheep meat today. Although the Merino was well suited for the environment, it still took up an absurd amount of land, requiring 6 acres for every sheep. This necessitated expanding the colonial land holdings deep into the interior holdings of the First Nations peoples. As it always does, conflict broke out, resulting in a period known throughout Australia history as the Killing Times. The advocacy group Together Yes details the horrific period for us, stating that mass killings or massacres of indigenous peoples by colonists began in the 1790s and continued for the following 140 years. The killing times have resulted in lasting intergenerational trauma. British soldiers armed with muskets on foot were the first slaughterers. Later, massacres were perpetrated by settlers and police, including the utilization of First Peoples as officers under the command of white commanders. As colonial frontiers pushed inland and firearms became readily available to settlers, the perpetrators arrived to the Aboriginal settlements on horseback and used rifles, shotguns, and carbines to hunt down and kill their victims. As well as shootings, there were recorded incidences of poisoned flour being distributed by white settlers to Aboriginal people. Some massacres in Tasmania involved chasing entire clans, women, men, elders, children, and babies, over cliffs into the sea and onto the rocks below. Just under half, 49% of the killings, were carried out by police and other colonial or state officials. 51% were carried out by civilians. Most killings were well planned and sanctioned by colonial, later state governments to teach them a lesson. For example, in reprisal for thefts of livestock. As the hinterland was opened up, the massacres increased, with more killings occurring between 1860 to 1930, then in the years after settlers arrived in 1788. Large pastoral companies were often involved in the killings. Most of the massacres perpetrated by stockmen took place in the Northern Territory. There were 19 recorded genocidal massacres in a short period from 1860, carried out by the same perpetrators over a number of weeks in reprisal for the killing of a colonist or colonists. European diseases did the rest. The prospect of wool profits began a settlement period of non-felons from England, but the real boost in migration happened during a 10-year period beginning in 1851, when gold, sapphires, opals, coal, and iron were all discovered. In this rush, more than 500,000 colonists decided to make Australia their new home, properly colonizing the land down under. So where do the rabbits come in? Aboard the original English fleet that brought the first 700 prisoners/settlers were 5 rabbits. Further records show that a minimum of 90 shipments of rabbits occurred over the next 70 years between the two islands. Detailed biological testing of the rabbits that inhabit Australia today, however, have ruled out any of these shipments as being the origin point for the Land of Oz's problems with the cuddly critters. Instead, the blame falls squarely upon the shoulders of Thomas Austin, who on Christmas Eve of 1859 received a gift of 24 rabbits. His intent was to hunt the bunnies, a traditional pastime in Australia's native England. El País, a Spanish newspaper, reveals that at least 2 of the 24 bunnies managed to avoid their death sentence by firing squad, writing that 3 years later the local press reported that there were already thousands of European rabbits in the country. Thomas himself acknowledged that he had slaughtered 20,000 of the animals on his property. By 1906, the rabbits had reached Australia's west coast, 4,000 kilometers away from Thomas Austin's property. So why would these rabbits proliferate across the country while 90 prior shipments had produced no discernible effect? The answer is that Thomas's shipment included wild rabbits rather than domesticated fluffballs. El País tells us that the right rabbits were in the right place at the right time, continuing the incredible tale by quoting Joel Alves, the lead author of the study that genetically pinned the infestation upon the poor hunting skills of Thomas. Alves states that we have historical and genetic evidence that most of the previous introductions were domestic rabbits. Austin's are the only ones explicitly described as wild and captured in a natural environment, which we have confirmed genetically. Among the historical evidence used is a recollection by Austin's granddaughter that he specifically asked for a dozen wild rabbits. Alves tells us that their wild ancestry probably gave these rabbits an advantage because they were better adapted to the harsh Australian landscape. Domestic rabbits are an easier target for predators because they have lost their flight response to danger, making them more docile and more strikingly colored, which in turn removes their natural camouflage. There are those that remain skeptical of placing all of the blame at the feet of Austin. Martin Nunez, a researcher at the University of Houston and an expert in invasion ecology, is one of those that questions the ability to identify the singular cause of the epidemic, pointing out that determining why some species invade and others don't is invasion biology's holy grail. Still, the researcher mentions that he found Alv's study to be quite compelling. Rabbits naturally proliferate, hence the colorful phrase, breed like rabbits. Be careful though, as that phrase will typically get you in a lot of trouble, such as when British Prime Minister Winston Churchill noted that English aid during the Bengal famine would be worthless, as in his words, Indians were breeding like rabbits. Catholics around the world were offended in 1969, when Ian Paisley, then the First Minister of Northern Ireland, claimed that Catholics breed like rabbits and multiply like vermin. Interestingly, they were also offended when Pope Francis claimed that being a good Catholic did not mean people should breed like rabbits. But I suppose there is no harm in claiming that rabbits breed like rabbits. The Will County Forest Preserve District goes through the factors that make bunnies one of the most prolific species on the planet. It turns out that cottontail rabbits can begin to breed as young as 2 to 3 months into their life, while a human baby requires a gestation period, or as one of my college friends creepily says, marinating period of 280 days. Rabbits only require a gestation period of between 25 to 28 days. Those numbers resulted in one of the most famous math problems in textbooks across the world. Known as the Fibonacci sequence, its author gave 3 considerations. First, a single newly born pair of rabbits, one male, one female, are put in a field. Second, rabbits are able to mate at the age of 1 month, so that at the end of its 2nd month, a female can produce another pair of rabbits. Third, rabbits never die, and a mating period always produces 1 new pair, 1 male, 1 female, every month from the 2nd month on. He then posed the question, how many pairs will there be in 1 year? The Smithsonian Magazine reveals that the subsequent Fibonacci sequence is a famous group of numbers beginning with 0 and 1, in which each number is the sum of the 2 before it. It begins 0, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 21, and continues indefinitely. The magazine points out that the pattern hides a powerful secret. If you divide each number in the sequence by its predecessor, except for 1 divided by 0, then as you move towards higher numbers, the result converges on the constant phi, or approximately 1.618, otherwise known as the golden ratio. While the process was initially used to identify mathematical patterns that were naturally occurring all around us, today it has been turned into a tool identified as Fibonacci retracement, a concept that incredibly is used today to predict buying and selling within the economic markets. Of course, rabbits don't just go on having 2 kids over and over again. While rabbits can have as many as 7 litters annually, they average 3 to 4, less in colder climates. Each litter isn't identical either, as they can carry anywhere between 1 to 12 babies at a time. Sadly, 44% of those kittens, as they are confusingly called, don't survive the first month of their life. If you are among those who thought that the term kitten for a baby bunny isn't nearly cute enough, I will try to win you back with the scientific fact that a group of bunnies is lovingly referred to as a fluffle. These fluffles are also held back from what appears to be an inevitable population explosion by short lifespan of merely 3 years, as well as an abundance of natural predators, including coyotes, birds of prey, snakes, bears. Even cats, raccoons, rats, and groundhogs have been known to attack and kill our long-eared friends, which leaves no wonder that Disney chose to make Judy Hopps into a rabbit for Zootopia's story. Rabbits do have some defense mechanisms, however. Elite speed. Their fur changes color with the seasons for camouflage, fantastic hearing and sense of smell, as well as boasting sharp claws, strong legs, and vicious teeth if it comes to a final showdown. But only Australia uses the term grey plague in describing Bugs Bunny's relatives. There are two reasons that rabbits are more of a problem for the Land of Oz. Firstly, Australia's mild winters mean that the rabbits are able to reproduce year-round, making a female's annual average litters carried at closer to 7 than the typical Northern American 3. Secondly, they have no real natural predators in Australia. That fact may seem shocking. After all, we started this podcast with the notion that everything in Australia seems capable of killing you. And to an extent, that's correct. But keep in mind that the only bear on the entire island, the koala, tends to be too high on eucalyptus leaves to chase you down, let alone chase down a rabbit. Alright, so none of us fear the cuddly koala, but we are naturally inclined to worry about the creatures on the top of the food chain, the apex predators. Amazingly, however, the elite predator of the land down under is the dingo. And while these wild dogs will take down a rabbit, the calorie count of the meal isn't worth the dingo's efforts at catching them. They would rather take down Australia's small deer, goats, or even the occasional kangaroo. But the thing that dingoes prefer the most are the invasive sheep that had come along with the British settlers. Australia used to have more terrifying apex predators, but the Tasmanian tiger, the marsupial lion, and the 1,300-pound lizard known as the Megalania have all gone the way of the dodo. It also happens to be where the Australian dingo population is headed, as they have become enemy number 2 for Australian sheep herders. Although rabbits don't hunt their sheep, they do affect the herder's livelihood enough to remain enemy number 1. That's because the rabbits solely exist upon grass, something that Australia doesn't have in abundance. Today, the creatures threaten the survival of more than 300 Australian native flora and fauna species. This includes 24 critically endangered species. The effect is so widespread because rabbits are known as ecosystem engineers, visibly removing grass from the topsoil while simultaneously burrowing beneath the ground to destabilize it from below. There is also damage that you don't see, as they prevent tree growth by eating them while they are mere seedlings. The advocacy group Rabbit Free Australia informs us that the critical rabbit density for the recruitment of many native seedlings is 1 rabbit, 2 hectares, and a similar level triggers a decline in native grasses. Above that density, native grasses decline due to selective grazing pressure and are replaced by unpalatable introduced weeds adapted to tolerate rabbit browsing. Rabbits also disseminate weeds by spreading undigested weed seeds in their feces, while the high level of nitrogen in their droppings promotes the growth of some weeds. The cost to Australian agriculture is measured at around $130 million each and every year. The effects have global implications. While North American cows tend to shoulder the blame whenever the United States fails to meet their climate change reduction goals due to the disturbingly high count of methane contained within their farts, it is rabbits that are blamed in Australia for the impending humanitarian and ecological disaster that is global warming. as one study has estimated the successful rabbit control in 25% of inland Australia's mulga woodlands would result in the sequestration of an additional 5 to 6 megatons of CO2 equivalents per year. Sounds good, right? So why doesn't Australia just rid itself of the rabbits? It isn't for a lack of trying. Individual bounties were put on the critters, and farmers used traditional traps as well as poisoning their burrows. Some even used bulldozers to destroy the warrens that infest their land. Because bunnies breed so fast and eat so much, the challenge is not to reduce, but completely remove the problem, as less than one rabbit per football field-sized paddock is enough to stop the growth of some native species and negatively affect biodiversity. In an example of government bureaucracy at its best, Australia formed the Intercolonial Rabbit Commission. Their expert-led recommendation in 1887 was to offer a £25,000 prize, the equivalent of $10 million today, to anyone who could figure out a solution for the infestation. The leader of the group, Brian Coleman, a man who spent 23 years of his professional life battling bunnies, reveals that the commission received more than 1,500 suggestions, most of which he claimed were pretty insane. Still, they implemented a number of them, including releasing large numbers of mongoose and feral cats, as well as using phosphate to indiscriminately kill all wildlife in an area. Lauren Alam, writing for the Australian Broadcast Corporation, even recalls a story that his father told him about this time period, where he came home after spreading the government-issued poisons around, only to discover that his hands now glowed in the dark. In 1901, the government of Australia pivoted to containing the damage and began the ambitious task of building a rabbit-proof fence to cordon off the West from the threat. Historian F.H. Broomhall describes it for us, writing that the height of the netting above ground averaged 2 feet 10 inches to 3 feet, and the depth underground 6 to 8 inches, except where the ground was sandy, and then it was 12 inches below the surface. The netting was 1 1/4 inches mesh and dipped in coal tar 18 inches from the bottom. There was a top wire 12 inches above the wire netting, and in the south this was mostly plain wire, but where there was stock, a barbed wire was used. The plan was foolproof, except for how costly and slow the construction would be, for the little mammals moved far faster than a typical minimum wage construction worker. The rabbits overtook the initial fence far before it was done, moving some 65 miles west in just 1 year. Within 70 years, rabbits were found to be living on 70% of Australia's landmass. The Australian National Science Agency rubs it in by adding to the end of their report that such a movement made it the fastest known invasion by a mammal anywhere in the world. The lack of modern transportation and equipment hindered the effort from the beginning, as A.W. Canning was in charge of the land survey to determine the path of the fence. The land that he traversed wasn't livable, but he was described by his peers as tough as nails. Actually, since he was in Australia, he was described as being made up of whale bones and sinew. But what do you expect from a nation whose slang calls sharks after darks, refers to milk as moo juice, and reminds you that thongs are flip-flops? Be on the watch if anybody in Australia is talking about their shark biscuits, a slang way of referring to kids playing on the beach. At one point during the fence survey operation, Canning walked 84 miles in 2 days, searching for water. And when he found it, it wasn't large enough to refuel the camels assigned to the operation. They had to go without a drink for 12 consecutive days. Danielle Olson, writing for Things magazine, writes that once the survey was complete, a wide path was cleared through the bush on either side of the chosen route. Depots were built, supplies were delivered, and construction began. Water-boring parties were organized to establish watering points, while others were organized to find feed for the animals. Holes were sunk in what was often rock-hard ground, and posts were made of whatever timber was available. Where there was no suitable timber, iron standards were used. Fence dimensions were standardized wherever possible. Posts 12 feet apart, strainers every 5 chains, posts not less than 4 inches in diameter at the small end, standing 4 feet above ground level and sunk 1 foot 9 inches below. At times, more than 400 men and 300 animals, camels, horses, and donkeys, were engaged in constructing the fence. They toiled in a capricious climate of brush fires, droughts, floods, and cyclones, which, as well as being difficult and uncomfortable to work in, threatened whatever progress had been made. At one point, the director of agriculture reported that 70 posts had been destroyed by fire and that in several places the netting beneath the ground had badly deteriorated or been eaten right through. On other occasions, whole sections of the fence were found buried by sand drifts. In 1903, boundary riders were tasked with maintaining the fence, regularly scanning the area for any signs of breakage. But in a world of naturally occurring brush fires and sandstorms that naturally change the composition of the land, the rabbits easily got past the barricade. Doubling down, the Australian government ordered an extension of the fence, and when that didn't work, they ordered yet another extension. Seems as though they hadn't yet heard of the old adage, "Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me." The extensions of the fence took the project to an astonishing 2,021 miles. A later dingo fence went even further, leading Australia to lay claim to having the longest quote-unquote wall in the world, greater than even the Great Wall of China. Maintaining that dingo fence costs Australia $750,000 annually, and it would take someone a full 6 months for them to try to walk around it. Australia's failure just reinforces the idea that walls are never the solution to life's problems. History is replete with examples. The Great Wall of China was expressly created to keep the Mongolians out, yet one of their greatest dynasties was Kublai Khan's Yuan dynasty. Although at least 140 were killed trying to cross it, the Berlin Wall was routinely circumvented as individuals crossed from the communist side of the divided city to the democratic western side. Some of the most infamous crossings include a convertible that was dropped so low to the ground that it could cruise beneath the barricade, a contortionist who sat hidden within luggage for 70 minutes, a homemade hot air balloon constructed out of 60 bed sheets, as well as an acrobat who tight-roped across buildings in order to go over the wall. So many managed to escape that the Berlin Wall actually became 2 separate walls. The land between them became known as the Death Strip. The only living creature in that no man's land happened to be rabbits. Bartek Konopka used the creatures as the vehicle for his Oscar-nominated documentary Rabbit à la Berlin to tell the story of life behind the Iron Curtain's walls. Unfortunately, their story, much like Australia's rabbit's own, ends poorly. The acclaimed director tells us that the rabbits were fragile and sensitive creatures. When they found Berliners trampling all over no man's land, they tried to run away, but weren't always up to it. For them, it was such a stress. They'd go through one street, look for the nearest bush, and stay there. but they were so frightened that they stayed there for many days and died from hunger. It was such a stress that they wouldn't think about what to eat. They'd just stand in one position and die. But as you can tell from this story, the creatures are natural survivors. Today, there remain 10 different colonies of wild rabbits in western Berlin, to go along with one in East Berlin. It seems as though even the rabbits knew that communism wasn't the path to a better life. Another film that hides its poignant message behind the wall is Rabbit Proof Fence, which tells the tale of 3 young girls who, upon escaping their own kidnapping, use the wall in Australia to discover their way home. The movie is based upon an acclaimed novel that reaches back into Australia's dark past of the colonial government, attempting to fundamentally alter the Aboriginal First Nations people. Dr. Benjamin Ruskoff reminds us that up to 100,000 Aboriginal children, especially those of mixed Aboriginal and European descent, were forcibly taken from their families by police or welfare officers because of a federal and state government edict. The main motive was to assimilate Aboriginal children into European society over 1 or 2 generations by denying and destroying their Aboriginality. In other words, just like animals, the European-descended colonists were reducing the indigenous peoples to a subhuman level. The journal Ecological Management and Restoration connects the existence of multiple fences that crisscross the island nation as a direct continuation of colonial-era attitudes that considered kangaroos, emus, and dingoes as vermin. Olson further elaborates, teaching that the fence is redolent of a European concept of ownership, laying out a boundary, marking one's territory, pegging out a corner, staking a claim, a physical means of asserting title to a piece of land. So very different from an Aboriginal concept of ownership, which is more about having the right to be on the land, the right to understand, and to know the stories that are associated with the land, and the right to speak for the land. And Ernestine Hill quipped that it was the only fence in the world that cuts a continent into 2 mighty paddocks. But perhaps I'm making things too complex. Perhaps it is just a really long wall that didn't work. Popular Mechanics succinctly explained that the Australian project failed because the fences didn't work very well. After all, rabbits are famous for jumping. As the rabbit population approached an absurd 600 million and continued westward, the government shifted to Plan B. If their lazy wildlife wasn't willing to feast upon the European rabbit, they would bring in a creature that was known to be up to the task. That way of thinking resulted in the importation of the European fox. Voice of America tells us that for Australia, the cure proved to be worse than the disease. It turned out the fox preferred to target easier prey, such as small marsupials, endemic to the country, and already threatened with extinction. In 1998, the Australian government was forced to introduce fox bounties in hopes of controlling that invasive animal population. This was despite the conclusion of a government study released the same year that found that not a single bounty program throughout the country's history had successfully reduced animal pests. Australians are a tough but stubborn people, a notion exemplified by a viral HBA insurance commercial from 16 years ago. In it, a smiling 3-year-old claims that a crocodile came up, bit my guts out, and bit me into pieces, and then my legs went that way, and then my head went that way, before the ad flashes the slogan, "Life's unpredictable. Make sure that your insurance isn't." Despite their stubbornness and gumption, the Aussies' $10 bounty for every foxtail turned in only resulted in the slaughter of 198,000 of the bushy-tailored tricksters. The Age, an Australian newspaper, wrote that the program had little long-term impact on fox populations. Indeed, the bounty, which cost the government $2.5 million, may have made things worse by priming the fertility of foxes next season. That last bit describes an unintended side effect of hunters breaking up female foxes from their mates, which in turn encouraged females to be more promiscuous. The introduction of the fox and Australia's subsequent failure at controlling their population has had a number of horrific effects on the land of Oz. They have already been blamed as the main cause for the extinction of 6 mammal species and threaten the survival of the spot-tailed quoll and the eastern barred bandicoot. Hunting for new victims, the Australian imports have been known to cull up to 30% of some regions' newborn lambs. They have even been known to sneak onto emu and ostrich farms. Unfortunately, there is little that can be done. The Age points out that the bounty failed for a number of reasons. First, people were collecting the tails from roadkill foxes. Some even broke in and stole a collection of already turned-in bounty tails in order to double dip. Second, it wasted government resources by paying hunters for doing something that they were already doing. Lastly, it was found that shooters recognized the financial incentive of not eradicating the species, which in turn resulted in the hunters leaving them alone during breeding season to ensure next year's crop. At this point in the story, Australia had attempted to contain its rabbit problem by utilizing every trick that the rabbit-obsessed Looney Tunes character of Elmer Fudd had available to him. They had hunted them, poisoned and destroyed their homes, imported and unleashed their ancient enemy upon them. None of it had worked, and the bunny population continued to multiply out of control. Meanwhile, rabbits continued to sweep westward like a plague at an astonishing rate. It was around that point that the Australian government decided to fight fire with fire, bringing in scientists to engineer a murderous solution. It wasn't actually a new idea, though. Remember the Intercolonial Rabbit Commission, which had offered a £25,000 prize to anyone who could come up with a solution? One of the individuals to take up the challenge was Louis Pasteur. Pasteur was born in 1822 in France and would go on to become one of the world's most renowned microbiologists. In some circles, he is even referred to as the father of bacteriology and germ theory of diseases. He was the guy that revealed that diseases could be prevented by killing or stopping germs. His studies would eventually result in vaccination, with it commonly being stated that although Edward Jenner invented vaccination, Louis Pasteur invented vaccines. In 1877, he began to weaken chicken cholera in order to introduce it to vulnerable chicken populations. In 1880, he was confident enough to share his findings with a wider scientific community. The report was revolutionary, and eventually led to massive breakthroughs for the study and delivery of vaccinations. Historian Herve Boson teaches us that despite Pasteur's claims, his vaccine against chicken cholera was not regular in its effects, and therefore a failure scientifically. Like any good scientist, however, the Frenchman continued his research, eventually producing a working method to vaccinate European cattle from anthrax. Despite his success, the Frenchman had larger dreams, but lacked the personality needed to rub elbows with society's elites. Controversially, he forced his family to keep his personal notebooks private. Upon their release in 1964, Pasteur was outed as being combative, arrogant, and dogmatic. He also may have stolen his greatest ideas from others, hiding their research and role in what he proclaimed to be his discoveries. At the time that the Intercolonial Rabbit Commission Prize was announced, Pasteur was desperately short of funds for his Institut Pasteur in Paris. The institute, and therefore the prize money, were viewed as essential to cement his legacy, something that we now know was far more flimsy than anyone believed at the time. The French microbiologist returned to his chicken cholera vaccine, his first big breakthrough. Unfortunately, the scientist was nearing the end of his life, having recently suffered a second stroke. Hoping to complete his institute before his time was up, he dispatched a team to Australia in 1888, headed by his nephew Adrian Lohr in hopes of claiming the prize. The team's plan was to reverse the vaccination process, which reduces the efficacy of a disease in order to trigger our body's natural immune systems. After our defenses know how to defeat the invaders, they can respond more effectively to a non-weakened attack. In this instance, Pasteur's team supercharged the chicken cholera virus, hoping to start a pathological contagion that would kill off the rabbits. In a pilot demonstration, it proved incredibly effective, killing every single rabbit that ate the contaminated food provided by Lohr's team. This success led Louis Pasteur to demand the prize money and be declared the victor. The commission, however, wisely withheld the £25,000 as the cholera virus killed all birds in the area, but only managed to murder the rabbits that had directly ingested the virus. As a disease, it wasn't spreading naturally among the population. Pasteur had figured out a way to rid Australia of the wrong species. "60 years later, disease research had advanced sufficiently to get a do-over. In the early 1920s, a Brazilian scientist named Henrique de Boafour Rohan Algaro sent cultures of a virus known as myxomatosis to 2 Australian scientists. The disease, which was spread by mosquitoes from the Andes, had been discovered in Uruguay, and that their wild rabbits were discovered to be reservoir hosts, which is a scientific way of designating the creature that the pathogen primarily depends upon for its survival. After years of testing, the disease went for trials in the United Kingdom as well as designated Australian field sites. Initial tests were incredibly effective, with the virus being found to kill up to 99.8% of all infected rabbits. Alam interviewed Brian Corman, the former head of the Intercolonial Rabbit Commission, for her broadcast, pointing out that Brian Corman remembers walking in a field with his father as a boy and looking at a hill, part of which was covered with bracken fern. He clapped his hands, and it was almost as if the whole surface of the ground got up and ran into the bracken fern. There were hundreds upon hundreds, perhaps thousands of rabbits. It was a sight I'll never forget. But after myxomatosis, the gray blanket disappeared. You could walk all day and not see a rabbit, says Corman. Even scientists were shocked by the cruel effectiveness of the disease. I had a friend, Bunny Furnessy, who was of course fortuitously named, said Corman. He remembers walking to the crest of this hill. There was a fence line and there was a gate. He leaned over the gate and looked down. In front of him was this mass of dead and dying rabbits. Blind rabbits moping around, birds of prey flying in the air, flies everywhere, a stench in the air. He was simply overawed. They had never seen sick rabbits before. That should have been the end of the story, but as Jurassic Park taught us, life will find a way. Initially devastated by the release of the South American virus, the surviving rabbits of Australia built up a natural immunity, and then proceeded to do what rabbits do best, once again breeding out of control. Joel Alves' study points to an evolutionary mutation that sets off a protein-based alarm in rabbit cells when a virus is detected. The findings revealed that the protein that helps rabbits fend off the myxomatosis virus has an antiviral effect on an unrelated virus called vesicular stomatitis, the result of which is explained by Professor Miguel Carneiro, who stated that while battling myxomatosis, rabbits may have increased their resistance to other viruses, including perhaps rabbit hemorrhagic disease, which is killing so many animals right now. One of the reasons that bioterror is such a poor weapon of mass destruction is the user's inability to narrowly target the weapon. Once unleashed, humans lose control of the contagion. Australia began to tinker with what had initially appeared to be their long sought-after breakthrough. As mosquitoes only spread the virus during summer months, the Australians needed to find a way to keep the plague raging year-round, as well as in the deserts which lack the annoying insects. Thus, they imported the Spanish flea, a known disease carrier of myxomatosis. Unfortunately, the invasive species quickly began to bother the native species that live throughout the outback. The New Zealand Journal of Zoology believes that their neighbors had crossed an ethical line at this point. The article points out that the increase in perceived risks entailed in the use of pest control technologies are largely the product of changes in human attitudes and in the collective values of our society. These changes are well exemplified in the comments from animal welfare researchers on the potential value of introducing the Spanish flea into Australia. They noted that, to say that rabbits are a problem serious enough to warrant infliction of a slow, painful death may once have been true, but it isn't now. Our ethical framework, based on consideration of all parties involved, leads us to reject as totally unjustifiable the current efforts to increase the spread and mortality of the myxomatosis virus by the use of the Spanish flea. But they hadn't tiptoed across the line. Encouraged by their initial success, the Australian scientists ran back to Pandora's box, releasing the rabbit hemorrhagic disease virus, or RHDV, in 1996. Again, it achieved remarkable success initially, but the critters quickly adapted and the biological arms race continued. RHDV2, a variant from Korea, was released in 2015. An analysis suggests that the wild rabbit population in portions of Australia was reduced by 60%. Today, farmers request the virus in the form of freeze-dried food, which they can introduce into the labyrinth of burrows that continue to infest their lands. While it is working, Chris Bright, a bioinvasion researcher, warns that biocontrol will never be a panacea, but it is still the best candidate for control in some situations. One lesson that Australia has learned from all of this is the need to temper expectations. Alarmism isn't productive, something that the Sunday Herald didn't understand on January 23, 1949, when its front page headline read, "Australia's Grey Plague Goes Unchecked," while its subheading in bold letters warned that Australia's rabbit plague has now reached such proportions that our wool industry, the most important in the Commonwealth, is in grave peril. Today, the nation's Center of Invasive Species warns that the Korean variant, referred to as K5, will not result in a 90% reduction of wild rabbit populations. Rather, it is expected to boost the effects of the existing variant and help slow down the increase in rabbit numbers. K5 is not the silver bullet for rabbit eradication in Australia, and an integrated approach is required. Obviously, Australia has its reasons for hating the fluffy creature that my youngest son and I both love. But that doesn't mean that they don't have a heart. Incredibly, domesticated rabbits are kept as pets in some of their states, and a vaccine exists in order to protect their pets from the various diseases that threaten their wild cousins. This means that not every Australian hates bunny rabbits. After all, Easter is happily celebrated throughout the land. Unique local twists of what started out as a Christian holiday includes pancakes, as well as enjoying hot cross buns, which are sweet spice buns usually filled with dried fruit. They also enjoy the traditional egg hunt. But seeing as how those eggs are delivered by the internationally loved Easter bunny, one has to wonder about that practice. The American right believes that there is a war on Christmas, as liberals keep insisting on wishing individuals happy holidays instead of formerically wishing everyone a Merry Christmas. Beck Crew, an Australian writing for Scientific America, informs us that there is a war going on, and the Easter Bunny is at the center of it. In 1968, 9-year-old Rose Marie Dusting wrote a story called Billy the Aussie Easter Bilby, about a beloved Australian variant of a bandicoot. The critters share a number of characteristics with rabbits, including a love of burrowing and floppy ears. But rather than eating up the livestock's grass, the bilby feasts upon grasshoppers, beetles, spiders, and termites. When Rose Marie turned 20, she republished the books, setting off a wave of interest in the endangered animal. In 1991, the Foundation for Rabbit-Free Australia began an Easter Bilby campaign to replace the Easter Bunny. Like all of Australia's efforts to eradicate the remnants of the original 24 rabbits of Thomas Austin, the campaign to dethrone the Easter Bunny hasn't fully succeeded. Still, you can find chocolate bilbies for sale throughout the stores of Australia during the Lenten season. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you want to interact with the show, you can email us at resourcesbylowry@gmail.com. You can also find us on the platform formerly known as Twitter. If you would like to financially support the show, please look in the description for more information. As always, thank you for listening, rating the show, and spreading the word.